The story of the Dead Sea Scrolls is one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, a find so extraordinary that it fundamentally changed our understanding of ancient religious texts and provided concrete evidence that has silenced critics who claimed biblical manuscripts had been corrupted over millennia. And this discovery began in 1947 in the most unexpected way imaginable. When a young Bedouin shepherd boy named Muhammad Adib, whose name means Muhammad the Wolf, was tending his goats near the rocky cliffs of Qumran along the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, in what was then British Mandate Palestine, just months before the creation of the State of Israel would transform the political landscape of the region forever. The landscape there is harsh and unforgiving, filled with limestone caves carved by wind and water over thousands of years, creating a maze of caverns in the steep cliff faces overlooking the salt, heavy waters below, where the Dead Sea sits at the lowest point on Earth's surface, nearly 1,400 feet below sea level, creating an environment so unique that the extreme dryness and mineral-rich air would prove crucial to preserving ancient documents that would otherwise have crumbled to dust centuries ago. On this particular day in late 1946 or early 1947, the exact date remains uncertain because Muhammad himself gave different accounts over the years. He noticed that one of his goats had wandered away from the flock, and as he searched for the animal among the rocky terrain, climbing over boulders and navigating the treacherous pathways between the cliffs, he spotted a small opening in one of the caves high up on the cliff face, partially hidden by rocks and accessible only by a difficult climb that would have deterred most people from investigating further. Being curious, like any young person might be, and perhaps hoping his goat had taken shelter there from the intense desert sun, he picked up a stone and tossed it into the dark opening, expecting to hear the scattering of hooves or the bleat of his lost animal, or perhaps the flutter of bats or birds that might have nested in the cave's dark recesses. Instead, what he heard was something completely unexpected, the distinct sound of pottery breaking, a sharp crack that echoed from within the cave and seemed to suggest that something man-made was stored inside, which was unusual because these caves were remote and difficult to access, not the kind of place where ordinary people would store everyday items. This sound would change his life and ultimately rewrite our understanding of ancient history, though Muhammad could not have known at that moment that he had just stumbled upon what scholars would later call the greatest manuscript discovery of modern times, a find that would occupy thousands of researchers for decades and generate millions of pages of scholarly analysis and debate. Intrigued and probably a bit nervous about what he might find, whether it might be treasure left by ancient peoples or perhaps something dangerous, Muhammad climbed up to the cave entrance, squeezing his body through the narrow opening that was barely large enough for a person to fit through, and entered into the darkness within, his eyes gradually adjusting to the dim light that filtered through the entrance from the bright desert sun outside. As his vision adapted to the cave's interior, he saw something that must have seemed both exciting and mysterious. A series of tall, cylindrical jars arranged along the cave floor, each one carefully sealed and preserved by the dry desert air that had kept them intact for nearly 2,000 years, though Muhammad had no way of knowing their age at that moment. These weren't ordinary storage jars that might contain grain or oil or water, the kind that Bedouin families had used for generations to store provisions. They were specially designed vessels, taller and narrower than typical storage containers, and when Muhammad carefully opened one of them, breaking the ancient seal that had protected its contents for millennia, he found bundles of ancient scrolls wrapped in linen cloth, their surfaces darkened with age but remarkably intact, considering they had been sitting undisturbed in this cave since around the time of Jesus Christ. Though again, Muhammad had no way of recognizing the historical significance of what he had discovered. At first, Muhammad and his cousin Juma Muhammad, who soon joined him in exploring the cave, didn't realize the significance of what they had found. They thought perhaps these old scrolls might be valuable as leather that could be sold to cobblers or craftsmen in Bethlehem who might use the material to make shoes or other goods, or perhaps they could sell them to antiquities dealers who sometimes purchased old items from Bedouin who found them in the desert. They took several of the scrolls back to their camp, carrying them carefully wrapped in cloth. And over the following weeks and months, these scrolls changed hands several times, passing through a complex network of antiquities dealers in Bethlehem and Jerusalem, with some people recognizing that the ancient Hebrew writing on the scrolls might be significant and potentially valuable, while others remained skeptical, thinking they might be medieval documents, or even clever forgeries designed to deceive gullible collectors. The scrolls were shown to various merchants and dealers, including Khalil Iskander Shahin, known as Kondo, a cobbler and antiquities dealer in Bethlehem, who would play a crucial role in bringing the scrolls to scholarly attention, though he too initially wasn't sure of their value or authenticity, and consulted with others about whether they were worth purchasing from the Bedouin who had found them. Eventually, through a series of transactions that involved both legitimate dealers and black market antiquities, traders. Several scrolls came to the attention of scholars at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and the American School of Oriental Research, also in Jerusalem, where serious academic study of ancient manuscripts was being conducted. When these experts, including Professor Eleazar Sukenik of Hebrew University and John Trevor of the American School, examined the scrolls using their knowledge of ancient languages, paleography, and archaeological methods, they were absolutely stunned by what they saw, because everything about these documents suggested extraordinary antiquity. The writing style showed characteristics of ancient Hebrew scripts that hadn't been used since before the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. The form of the Hebrew letters matched styles that scholars had only seen in much later copies of ancient texts, or in brief inscriptions on coins and ossuaries. The material and construction of the scrolls using parchment made from carefully prepared animal skins, and sewn together with linen thread matched ancient manufacturing techniques, and everything pointed to these documents being authentically ancient, dating back to somewhere between 300 BCE and 100 CE, making them roughly 1,000 years older than any previously known biblical manuscripts, and providing an unprecedented window into the religious world of ancient Judaism. This discovery triggered one of the most extensive archaeological searches in modern history, because if one cave contained such treasures, surely other caves in the area might hold similar finds. And between 1947 and 1956, teams of scholars, some archaeologists, and Bedouin searchers employed by the archaeological teams combed through every cave in the Qumran area, systematically exploring hundreds of caves in the cliffs, and finding scroll material in 11 different caves, which are now designated as Qumran Caves 1 through 11, each with its own unique collection of materials and its own story of discovery. These searches recovered hundreds of manuscripts in varying states of preservation, from nearly complete scrolls like the Great Isaiah Scroll from Cave 1, which contained all 66 chapters of the biblical book largely intact, to thousands upon thousands of tiny fragments, some containing only a few letters or words that would require decades of painstaking scholarly work to identify, classify, and attempt to reconstruct into readable texts. The total collection includes biblical texts covering portions of every book of the Hebrew Bible except the book of Esther, which is a curious absence that has led to much speculation about whether the Qumran community rejected this book, or whether Esther's scrolls simply haven't survived or haven't been discovered yet, as well as community rules that governed the daily life of the sect that created this library, hymns and prayers that expressed their devotion and theology, commentaries on biblical books that showed how they interpreted Scripture in light of their own times and experiences, apocalyptic writings that described their expectations of the end times, and the final battle between good and evil in previously unknown texts that had been completely lost to history for 2 millennia, but now gave scholars access to Jewish religious literature from the Second Temple period that had never been available before. The scrolls were written primarily in Hebrew, the sacred language of Jewish scripture, and the language in which most of the Hebrew Bible was originally composed, with some portions in Aramaic, which was the common spoken language of Jews in this period, and the language Jesus himself would have spoken in daily life when talking with his disciples, and teaching the crowds in a few texts in Greek, which was the international language of the Eastern Mediterranean world, following the conquests of Alexander the Great, and was used by educated people throughout the Roman Empire. They were inscribed on parchment made from sheep, goat, or calf skins that had been carefully prepared through a lengthy process of soaking, scraping, stretching, and treating to create a smooth, durable writing surface that could last for centuries if properly stored, or on papyrus made from Egyptian reed plants that were cut into strips, laid crosswise, pressed and dried to create sheets suitable for writing, with a few texts even written on thin sheets of copper that had been hammered flat and inscribed with a sharp tool, creating permanent records that couldn't be erased, altered, or easily destroyed. What made this discovery absolutely revolutionary for biblical scholarship and changed the entire academic conversation about biblical reliability was that among these hundreds of manuscripts, scholars found portions of every book of the Hebrew Bible except the book of Esther. And when they compared these ancient texts to the medieval manuscripts that had been used for centuries as the basis for modern Bible translations, particularly the Masoretic text, which had been carefully preserved by Jewish scribes called Masoretes, working between the 6th and 10th centuries CE in centers of Jewish learning in Babylon, and later in Tiberias in northern Israel, they found something absolutely astonishing that would fundamentally change scholarly understanding of biblical transmission and provide empirical evidence for the reliability of the biblical text. The text had remained remarkably stable and accurate across a span of 1,000 years, with only minor variations in spelling or grammar that any linguist would recognize as normal variation within a living textual tradition. Occasional differences in word choice that represented synonyms or alternative ways of expressing the same idea, but didn't substantially change meaning, and virtually no significant changes in content, theology, or narrative, demonstrating a level of textual preservation that far exceeded what scholars had previously thought possible for ancient documents that had to be copied by hand generation after generation without the benefit of printing presses or modern technology to ensure perfect reproduction. This was particularly dramatic and scientifically verifiable in the case of the Book of Isaiah, one of the major prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible containing 66 chapters of prophecy, poetry, and theological reflection, where a complete scroll of all 66 chapters was found in Cave 1, now known as the Great Isaiah Scroll, or designated by scholars as 1Q Isaiah, to indicate it was the first Isaiah manuscript found in Qumran Cave 1. And when scholars compared this ancient Isaiah scroll, which radiocarbon dating of the linen wrappings and paleographic analysis of the handwriting style dated to around 100 BCE, to the medieval Masoretic text of Isaiah that had been carefully preserved by Jewish scribes and dated to around 1000 CE based on colophons and historical records of when the manuscripts were produced, they found that despite being copied and recopied over a millennium, separated by 1,000 years of transmission history during which the scrolls had to be manually copied by scribes working without the original to compare against, the text was virtually identical in all significant respects, with differences amounting to just a few variant spellings that represented different conventions for writing Hebrew, the occasional missing or added letter that represented different grammatical forms or ways of spelling the same word, but produced identical meanings when read aloud. Some variations in the use of vowel letters called matris lectionis, which ancient Hebrew writing didn't originally include systematically, but which later scribes added to help readers pronounce the text correctly, and extremely minor differences that any linguist or textual critic would recognize as the normal insignificant variations that occur naturally in any manuscript transmission tradition, but don't affect the meaning, theology, or message of the text at all. This discovery provided powerful empirical evidence, the kind that could be examined, tested, verified, and replicated by any scholar regardless of their religious beliefs or lack thereof, against the common skeptical claim that had been made by critics of biblical reliability for over a century, especially since the rise of historical critical scholarship in the 19th century. The claim that biblical texts had been corrupted or significantly altered over the centuries through repeated copying, either through accidental scribal errors that accumulated over time like mutations in a genetic code, or through deliberate theological changes made by copyists who wanted to adjust the text to match their own beliefs, support particular doctrines, or remove elements they found problematic, or through the natural degradation and corruption that affects all ancient texts as they're transmitted across generations and copied by fallible human beings who make mistakes, get tired, misread their exemplars, or introduce their own theological biases into the copying process. The Dead Sea Scrolls showed instead that ancient scribes, particularly the Jewish scribal tradition that preserved the Hebrew Bible with such remarkable care and dedication, had worked with extraordinary precision, reverence for the sacred text, and commitment to accurate transmission, developing sophisticated techniques to ensure accuracy, including counting letters and words in each section to verify that nothing had been added or omitted, noting unusual spellings or rare words in marginal notes, so future copyists would know these weren't errors, creating elaborate systems of checks and cross-checks to verify that copies matched their exemplars exactly, establishing schools where scribes were trained in proper techniques and could practice their craft under the supervision of master scribes, and treating the text with such profound respect that even damaged or incorrect copies were not destroyed but were carefully preserved in special storage repositories called genizas, rather than being discarded, which is why we have the Cairo Geniza, discovered in the late 19th century and other repositories of ancient Jewish manuscripts that have provided scholars with thousands of fragments representing centuries of Jewish literary and religious culture. The community that created and preserved these scrolls in the Qumran caves is believed by the overwhelming majority of scholars who have studied the archaeological remains, the manuscript contents, and the historical context to have been the Essenes, one of several Jewish sects that flourished during the Second Temple period, alongside the better-known Pharisees who emphasized strict adherence to the Torah and oral traditions, and appear frequently in the New Testament Gospels as debating partners and sometimes opponents of Jesus, and the Sadducees, who were associated with the temple priesthood, denied the resurrection of the dead and accepted only the written Torah while rejecting oral traditions, though some scholars have proposed alternative identifications, including other Jewish groups whose names and practices we know less about, splinter movements within Judaism that aren't well documented in historical sources, or even early Christians, though the latter theory has very little support among mainstream scholars because the scrolls show no knowledge of Jesus, don't mention any of the key events of early Christianity, and reflect thoroughly Jewish concerns and interpretations without any of the distinctively Christian theological developments. The ancient Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who was born Joseph ben Matityahu and lived in the 1st century CE, participating in the Jewish revolt against Rome, before surrendering and becoming a client of the Roman emperors, wrote detailed accounts of Jewish history and culture for Roman audiences in his major works, including The Jewish War and Antiquities of the Jews. And in these works, he described the Essenes as practicing a strict and highly regulated form of Judaism that set them apart from other Jews, emphasizing ritual purity, achieved through frequent washings and baths that symbolized spiritual cleansing, and maintained their status as a holy community separated from the corruption of mainstream Jewish society. Communal living, where property was shared among members rather than privately owned, with some members contributing all their possessions to the community treasury, while others maintained some private property but shared resources for the common good. Celibacy, or very restricted marriage, practiced by at least some members of the group, with Josephus noting that while some Essenes married for the purpose of producing children, others remained celibate to maintain maximum purity and avoid the distractions of family life in preparation for an imminent divine intervention in human history, when God would judge the wicked, vindicate the righteous, destroy the forces of evil, and establish his kingdom on earth in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. The scrolls discovered at Qumran give us an unprecedented window directly into their daily life, their beliefs, their interpretations of Scripture, and their understanding of their role in God's cosmic plan, with documents like the Community Rule, also called the Manual of Discipline, or designated by scholars as 1QS, describing in remarkable detail how new members were initiated through a rigorous process that included examination of their knowledge of Torah and commitment to the community's way of life, a probationary period during which candidates lived with the community but weren't full members, and finally, full admission marked by taking oaths of loyalty and contributing property to the common fund. How property was contributed to the common treasury and managed by appointed officials for the benefit of all members with strict accounting to prevent theft or misuse. How communal meals were conducted with prayers and blessings, ritual purity requirements that members had to meet before participating, and specific seating arrangements that reflected the hierarchical structure of the community, and how discipline was maintained within the group through a graduated system of responses, including verbal admonitions for minor infractions, temporary expulsions from communal meals or meetings for more serious violations, reduction in food rations as punishment for certain offenses, and permanent excommunication reserved for the most serious breaches of community standards. The Community Rule also laid out the theological framework that governed the sect's understanding of the world, describing a cosmic dualistic battle between the forces of light, led by the Prince of Light, or the Angel of Truth, and the forces of darkness, led by the Angel of Darkness, or Belial, explaining that God had created these two spirits and assigned humanity to walk in one path or the other, and teaching that the community members were the sons of light, who had been chosen by God to prepare the way for his coming intervention, while the rest of humanity walked in darkness and would face judgment. The War Scroll, another key document designated as 1QM, provided elaborate and detailed descriptions of an apocalyptic final battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness that the community expected would occur at the end of days, including specific military formations that the angelic and human armies would use, strategies and tactics for different phases of the battle, the design and inscriptions that would appear on banners, shields, and trumpets used in the conflict, prayers and liturgical texts to be recited before, during, and after each engagement, and theological reflections on God's role in ensuring victory for his people despite being outnumbered by the forces of evil. The Thanksgiving hymns, a collection of religious poetry designated as 1QH, contain dozens of beautiful poetic prayers expressing gratitude to God for his mercy and deliverance, confession of human weakness and sinfulness, devotion to God, and commitment to following his ways despite persecution and opposition, and reflections on the speaker's experiences of suffering, vindication, and divine protection, showing the deep spirituality and personal piety of the community members who composed or copied these prayers for use in their devotional life. The copper scroll discovered in Cave 3 and designated as 3Q15 was particularly unusual and has generated enormous interest and speculation because, unlike all the other Dead Sea Scrolls, which were written on leather parchment or papyrus, this text was inscribed on copper sheets that had been hammered thin and then rolled up for storage, and rather than containing biblical texts or religious teachings, it appeared to be a treasure map or inventory describing the locations of vast quantities of gold and silver precious objects and valuable temple vessels that had allegedly been hidden in various locations around Jerusalem and the Dead Sea area, with each entry specifying a location using cryptic descriptions and landmarks, the type of treasure hidden there, and the quantity involved, sometimes running into tons of gold and silver if the measurements are taken literally. The question of whether this treasure was real or symbolic remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of Dead Sea Scrolls research, with some scholars arguing that the quantities are too enormous to be realistic and must represent either symbolic numbers, a literary fantasy, or perhaps a record of temple treasures that the community hoped would exist but that were never actually hidden. While other scholars and numerous treasure hunters have taken the document literally and mounted expeditions to try to locate the sites described, though none have reported finding any of the treasures. Despite decades of searching, and despite some claims that have been made over the years about discovering some of the locations mentioned in the scroll. Beyond the biblical manuscripts that provided such powerful evidence for the accurate transmission of Scripture and the sectarian documents that illuminated the life and beliefs of the Qumran community, the scrolls also included previously unknown works of Jewish literature from the Second Temple period, including expanded versions of the Book of Enoch, an apocalyptic work attributed to the biblical figure Enoch, who walked with God and was taken up to heaven, which describes Enoch's heavenly journeys, his visions of the final judgment, the fall of the rebellious angels, and the coming of God's kingdom, the Book of Jubilees, which retells the stories of Genesis and Exodus with additional details, interpretations, and a focus on calendar issues that were important to the Qumran community, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, which presents deathbed speeches attributed to each of Jacob's 12 sons containing ethical teaching, prophecy, and warnings against sin, and numerous other works that expand our knowledge of Jewish theological thinking, biblical interpretation, and religious practice in the centuries immediately before and during the emergence of Christianity. These documents are incredibly valuable for scholars studying the development of Jewish thought because they come from a period when Judaism was incredibly diverse and creative, with different groups proposing different interpretations of Scripture, different practices, and different expectations about God's future intervention in history. And they show that many ideas that later became important in Christianity, including messianic expectations focusing on a coming deliverer who would defeat God's enemies and establish his kingdom, apocalyptic worldviews expecting an imminent end to the present evil age, emphasis on spiritual purity and separation from worldly corruption, and interpretation of Scripture as referring prophetically to contemporary events and future fulfillment, were already present in Jewish thought before Jesus began his ministry and didn't represent novel Christian innovations, but rather drew on existing Jewish theological concepts and reinterpreted them in light of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. The process of studying, translating, publishing, and making available the Dead Sea Scrolls has been a massive international scholarly effort that continues to this day, with the initial team of editors appointed in the early 1950s, working for decades to piece together thousands of fragments, some no larger than a fingernail. Trying to reconstruct complete texts from what essentially became an enormous jigsaw puzzle where most of the pieces were missing or damaged, the remaining pieces had faded or deteriorated, and there was no picture on the box to show what the completed puzzle should look like. The scholars had to use their knowledge of ancient Hebrew and Aramaic grammar, biblical and Jewish literary styles, historical context, and paleography to identify which fragments might belong. Together determine what biblical or other texts they represented, fill in gaps where material was missing, and produce coherent reconstructions that could be translated and studied by other scholars, and this work required extraordinary patience, linguistic skill, and scholarly cooperation, as fragments were sorted, catalogued, photographed, and analyzed. The scrolls had survived in remarkably good condition compared to what you might expect from 2,000-year-old documents that had been stored in desert caves without climate control or professional conservation, but they were still extremely fragile, with many having deteriorated into fragments when the original jars were opened or broken, when the caves were first explored by people who didn't realize the importance of careful archaeological technique, or when early handlers didn't understand how to properly preserve ancient parchment and papyrus. Conservation efforts have been absolutely crucial to ensuring these invaluable documents survive for future generations, with the scrolls now being housed in specially designed climate-controlled environments at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, where the shrine of the book building was specifically constructed to house and display the Dead Sea Scrolls with careful attention to temperature, humidity, light exposure, and security, and at other institutions around the world that hold fragments from the collection, where conservation specialists monitor the condition of the manuscripts, use special techniques to unfold, flatten, and preserve fragments that have become twisted or stuck together, and employ cutting-edge technology to study the scrolls without causing further damage to these precious and irreplaceable artifacts.